Welcome. Welcome, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us tonight for this exciting session on how we're facing the future of American Judaism. We are privileged to have a wonderful collection of speakers here tonight, and you'll get to hear from them and hear introductions to them in just a moment. But I also want to thank the group of people that have come together to put together this event. First, I want to thank the Jewish Communal Leadership Program, which has really been our entree onto the university campus, and especially Paige Walker, who has put in hours of work. I also want to thank Hillel for their partnership in marketing this event. My name is Robin Pollack, and I'm co-chairing tonight's event with Betty Kotzen. We're members of Temple Beth Emet, and Temple Beth Emet is the main sponsor of tonight's event. The Temple Beth Emet staff has worked tirelessly in pulling together all of the details, and I want to thank Nellie, Sarah, Tori, Victoria, and definitely Melissa for their hours and hours of work as well. In addition, I want to thank the members who behind the scenes have supported tonight's event to allow us to have the space in this museum, the dessert reception following, and I appreciate the generosity of all who have come together to make this evening possible. Finally, this space is beautiful, and there are a lot of rooms in our community, on our campus, but the museum has been a fantastic partner, and Bruce Glazer has been an individual who has helped us make the logistics come together. So thank you to UMMA and to Bruce Glazer for helping us put this together. Our moderator for the conversation that we'll be having is Rabbi Josh Whinston, the rabbi of Temple Beth Emet. We've been privileged to have Josh as our leader in Ann Arbor for 3 years, and he has been connected with all of the folks here on stage in deep conversation about the topic that we're engaging tonight. So I'll pass it over to Josh, who will lead us in digging in.
Thank you. Thank you, Robin, and I just want to do another big thank you to both Robin and Betty, who tonight, earlier today, tomorrow, we have things planned all day long with Rabbi Jacobs, with Rick, and especially also for those of us who like to go to synagogue, 7 p.m. tomorrow night at Temple Beth Emet for Shabbat services and hearing again from Rick that evening tomorrow. So please do join us. I'm not going to spend much time at all going into the bios of the folks that are sitting up here. They're in your handouts, and you can read more about them. Because I really want to dig into what we're talking about tonight. But I will just introduce. Although I think if you don't know, especially who the three locals are, and you're part of the Jewish community, I don't know where you've been. But Karla Goldman. Deborah Dashmore. Rick Jacobs. And Tilly Seamus. Tilly, I do want to say before we get started that you're sitting on the stage with 2 academics and 2 rabbis, so you're the only one that anybody's going to listen to. So that's probably good for you, I think.
Thanks.
Yeah. So the format for tonight, each of the 4 speakers are going to have a maximum of 5 minutes to introduce their thoughts on the future, facing the future of American Judaism, of Judaism in America. And then we are going to move into a sort of fishbowl scenario. I have a series of questions that we'll be discussing, or that they'll be discussing, and hopefully I'll be prodding along the discussion as we go. There will be time much later where note cards will get passed out for some questions. So don't worry about questions right now. Just hopefully engage as best you can in the conversation that's happening up here, and we'll, I hope, get some really, I'm sure, get some very insightful messages from each of these folks. I'll add, though, before we begin, that when thinking about this evening and who to ask to be on this panel, given the expertise that sits on this stage with me, it felt very appropriate to have Karla as the head of the Jewish Communal Leadership Program, and to see from her perspective what the future of the Jewish world looks like as she helps to shape and turn out more Jewish professionals into our world, and Deborah as a historian of American Jewish history, to have that perspective in the conversation, and of course Tilly, who is working tirelessly day in and day out with college students here on the campus, and then of course having Rick as the leader of the Reform movement. To have all of these different perspectives come together to have a conversation about the future of American Judaism felt like an amazing opportunity to me. So I'm glad all of you thought so as well. I'm going to stop talking now and invite Deborah to begin for us.
Okay. So you all can hear me, see me? Okay. So as a historian, as was mentioned, in preparing my remarks, my eye fastened on a small cluster of books on my shelves with the word future in them. The Future of the Jews, A People at the Crossroads, ? By David Vital. Imagining the Jewish Future, Essays and Responses, edited by David Teutsch. Facing the Future, Essays on Contemporary Jewish Life, edited by Steve Bain. Intrigued, I opened one. Here is how Vital, a noted Israeli historian of Zionism, begins. This book owes its existence to a generous invitation that enabled me to teach at an American university while continuing to hold a regular appointment at my home university in Tel Aviv. I was thus in a position to see aspects of American, but most especially Jewish American, life somewhat more closely and continuously than had been the case in the past. More particularly, owing to the timing, I found myself witness to particularly steep rise in the long-standing but hitherto somewhat muted tension between large sections of the Jewish American public and the state and people, and of course, the government of Israel. This was published in 1990. David Teutsch's edited volume came out 2 years later. And opening it, I noticed that I had written one of the responses he had solicited. In my case, to sociologist Egon Mayer's The Coming Reformation in American Jewish Identity. Rereading my response, I was relieved to discover that it was okay. I hadn't made a fool of myself. One of my points, actually, is worth reiterating this evening, and it was, and I'm going to quote myself, which is pretty self-indulgent, but you'll forgive me. We must remain aware of what the future holds for America, because our fate as American Jews is now intimately linked to the United States. If the United States is becoming a more conservative society, if it is inclining toward a revival of fundamentalism, if it is a less racist and more permissive society, if it is becoming more egalitarian, then American Jews will be swept along in these changes. Jews rarely swim against the tide in America, though they may often be found riding the first waves onto shore. This holds true today, I think, as much as 30 years ago. One thing that is likely to be true about the United States in the future is that it will be different, even as there will also be continuities. So when we speak about American Judaism, we need to recognize that the American modifier will mean something different down the road. But what about Judaism? Well, Judaism has a long history of change. I'd like to pinpoint one shift that occurred that perhaps might be worth considering. And I refer not to Daniel Boyarin's recent book, Judaism, The Genealogy of a Modern Notion, in the Keyword series in Jewish Studies series, where he persuasively argues that Judaism is not a word or concept used in any Jewish language before modernity, and hence not a Jewish term. No. Rather, I speak of the commonplace definition of Judaism as a religion in the United States. Over a century ago, the biblical scholar Israel Friedlander, recently arrived in New York City to teach at the Jewish Theological Seminary, observed that American Jews possess the opportunity to return to Judaism's original function as a culture, as the expression of the Jewish spirit and of the whole life of the Jews. That's a quote. What Friedlander hoped would occur didn't really happen. Instead, World War II, and especially American Jews' military service, encouraged them to think about Judaism as a religion, one of the three fighting faiths of democracy. I think that it would be valuable to return to this older vision of Judaism as a culture, an expression of Jewish spirit and the whole life of Jews, not only something that we associate with synagogues and holidays, but encompassing a way of life. In many respects, American Jews live Jewish lives, even if they don't observe that foreign term, Judaism. I think it would be helpful to take some cues from American Jews to figure out how Judaism can be understood to embrace their lives.
Thank you. Karla?
I'm going to stand just because. Actually allows me to feel a little more informal, strangely. So thank you for including me in this. This is my 9th year working with the students in the Jewish Communal Leadership Program. And from the beginning, whenever we've been a part of large or small communal gatherings, including something like this, I've said to them to try to listen for what people are afraid of, to pay attention to the anxieties that folks are sharing, and to notice what they're not talking about. We've encountered a lot of fears over the last 9 years, whether they've been about the lack of... That was scary. Are you okay? I know. So whether the fear has been about the lack of young people choosing to remain in Metro Detroit, the specter of Jews without religion that arose in the 2013 Pew study of Jewish Americans, the enduring anxiety over BDS, questions about the sustainability of our institutions, or fear of the resurgence of anti-Semitism, particularly, and this despite Pittsburgh from the left. I've also heard the concerns of my students, frustration with a community that hesitates in embracing individuals who feel completely invested in Jewish life, but who may have a non-Jewish parent. Concern about a community that doesn't really believe that young people who criticize Israel could really be engaged Jews. A disgust with megadonors who appear to be paying for a Jewish community that meets their needs rather than the needs of the young people they claim to serve and they want to attract. Irritation with a community that often ignores the voices of the young people in trying to serve them, but also one that thinks that there's really nothing sexy about continuing to invest in vital social needs like services for the elderly. In our seminar every week, they break their heads and their hearts trying to hold compassion for Jews who feel the threat and pain of anti-Semitism, as well as for the vulnerability of both Jewish and non-Jewish people of color. They yearn for Jewish leaders to acknowledge how their communities have benefited from white privilege and affluence, and for those who criticize Jewish communities to realize that while anti-Semitism is not the same as racism, it holds its own deadly threat for Jews and as a tool of white supremacy, all Jews and all people of color. The future for American Jews will be found, I think, somewhere between the hopes and fears of our students and those of the larger community. As history suggests, and the light bulb joke goes, the Jewish community is capable of adjusting to the buffeting winds of change we see in advancing assimilation and intermarriage, in distracted online individualism, and in a challenging relationship with Israel. but only if it wants to change. We won't get anywhere if we refuse to recognize or engage the questions that confront us. We can't pretend that most of our community will continue to have two Jewish parents. We can't pretend, as seemed to be happening when we were at the General Assembly in Tel Aviv in October, that we can address the growing alienation of young American Jews from Israel without talking about the occupation or Israel's treatment of Palestinians. We can't assume that we'll always know what we mean when we use the word we. In facing that future, we have to decide how to balance the challenge of getting people in the door with offering them something of worth once they come in. In the midst of the distressing realities in which we live, people are looking for connection, for community, and meaning. Those of us who are here because we care about the future of Judaism know that we have all of this on offer, that our tradition offers resources to address these aches. More than that, there are incredible examples of vital, thriving, generative Jewish spaces all over the country where people are able to tap into the present and the future in ways that our engaged tradition can offer. In fact, sometimes I ask, when I see all the good that's going on, why are we in so much trouble? Now, many communities respond to the challenges that they see by lowering the threshold to entry. Maybe if we make things free, maybe if we don't ask for too much knowledge, maybe if we don't ask for too much commitment, maybe if we avoid the tough questions that are confronting us, maybe if our app is better than their apps, we'll be able to build that community that we need. But if we do that, we sacrifice our competitive advantage, which is a possibility of being an antidote in some way to that American that advances forward, not always in directions that feel good. Because we know that a meaningful Jewish community asks more of us, not less. More time, more study, more commitment, more challenge. And yet, as much as we all here, you all showed up, maybe yearning for more community and connection and depth, you know what? It's still hard to get up on Saturday morning and go to synagogue or some other version of Jewish community that is in our view. So what do we do about this tension? How do we deal with wanting people to come in and the fear that we'll ask them to do too much when they get there? So here's one thing. I don't know. I don't really know the answer to that, but here's a thought. One of the things that I would suggest is that we stop making this distinction between core and periphery, right? That we stop not being able to see those who don't look like us, who might make us uncomfortable, who might seem to be on the outside, who might have the wrong parents, the wrong sexuality, the wrong politics, the wrong color. We have to do more than just invite those people in. We need to let them help us redefine what we see as the center. If you think about it, the strength of Judaism, certainly of American Judaism, has often come from our experience as both insiders and outsiders. And when people who are on the outside, as Jews have been through long parts of history, are allowed to come in, we recognize what they're able to contribute and how, for instance, in the case of Jews in American society, they've done so much to shape our social movements and our culture. Even in the Jewish context, there's a lot of concern these days about how there aren't enough men, right? There are too many women doing too many things. But think about why that might be. Judaism as culture has kept women out of public spaces of Judaism. It's really only in the last 50 years, although I would argue longer in some ways, but in this really recognized way, that Jewish women have come in and created so much. And how different is our Judaism for better 50 years on because of their contributions? I don't think there's an upside to keeping people out. If we cease to distinguish between core and periphery, and if we ask folks in, and we truly ask them in to the center, and to engage with the rest of us, and with a Judaism that is serious, challenging, engaging, connecting, in ways that is meaningful to them and to all of us, then who knows what we will create? I don't know, but I think I'd like to be a part of it.
Tilly, I'm going to have you go next, please.
Sure.
So Josh, I'm really grateful that you asked the Canadian to be on a panel about American Jewish future. I'm really going to do my best. But I think really my role as a Hillel director and being able to see this particular campus as a microcosm of American Jewish life allows me to have a particular insight into what is coming down the road if it's not already here. So I want to offer 3 observations that I see reflected in what I would call Generation Z, but you would call Generation Z, which I would call beyond the Bima, beyond Facebook, and beyond the building. So first off, beyond the Bima, I mean 2 things really by this. And I truly believe that our students, all they want is to be seen, they want to be heard, and they want to know that they matter to us. They want to be seen, as Karla said, in their full, diverse, multi-interested, intersectional selves. And I believe that this can only happen through real time together and through building real relationship. This generation does not want to be labeled or put in any box. They want to be engaged, and they want to engage, and that cannot happen with a figure that they see far away from them on a bima. At Hillel, we sit with our students at Shabbat, we text them after a hard exam, we invite them into our homes, and they can access us whenever they need us. Every Jewish freshman is given my personal cell phone number so that they know that they can always reach me. Our staff spend hours every week getting to know our students over coffee. We care about their souls and their journeys and their experiences, not that they are attending our programs and our services. So when a student or an alum is struggling, whether it's after an active shooter warning on campus or after Pittsburgh, they know they have someone to reach out to personally. I believe that we will be a much stronger Jewish community in the future if every Jew had the personal cell phone number of a rabbi or a Jewish leader, and they knew that they were accessible to them and cared about them beyond attendance at services and programs. But beyond the Bima is not just about a Judaism that is far away, but it's about making a Judaism that is relevant and that can be integrated into our students' lives. In asking students what they felt was most meaningful to them Jewishly on campus, they said that they do not want a Judaism that feels somehow separate, that's something that they have to step out of their regular experiences or community in order to experience. Most of the programming generated by our Hillel groups are about meeting students based on their identity and their interests, whether that's as women or law students or LGBTQ students, engineers, students interested in the outdoors, making Jewish life feel relevant to them and integrated into their daily lives. The second is beyond Facebook, and I think we have to talk about technology throughout our discussion tonight. I feel like I observe such a cross-generational judgment towards this generation of students with their lives in their phones and their pictures of avocado toast. And I am guilty of this as well. I judge them, and I also post my avocado toast. We always say at Hillel that we have to be where the students are to reach them. That's Letka's in the library, that's Hamantashen on North Campus, but that also means that we have to be in their phones in order to be in their lives. And we are way behind if all we are using is email and Facebook. If your experiences are not on Instagram, they simply did not happen. We have to be on platforms that are readily accessible and that add meaning to students' days while they are sharing their lives with their friends online or distracting themselves by walking through the diag. We will always need to be countercultural, and we will always need to go beyond the technology because we can offer the ability for our community to build community, to be in relationship with one another, but that does not preclude the other. Even in our real-life interactions where we are building community, the impact can continue, if not be elevated, by continuing through online communication as a community, through GroupMe, WhatsApp, whatever you may choose. And lastly, beyond the building. This is really a question of how far our institutions are willing to extend themselves beyond their walls. While we love our biggest program of the week, our Shabbat at Hillel, we know that there are thousands that we are not reaching every week. Our at-home program, supporting Shabbat experiences in the home, has a much broader one-touch reach than our own Shabbat dinners. We know that we can deepen the experience with the returning students, but in order to reach those students, we have to reach them where they are, which is in their homes. Part of this is by dropping the ego of the name and centrality of the building and simply enabling and supporting Jewish lives where Jews are already congregating. This is the Uber Eats generation. They do not want to get out of their pajamas and leave the comfort of their couch if they don't have to. They want to be with their friends on Fridays. They don't want to feel as if they have to remove themselves from one community in order to join another. Judaism needs to be able to shift, to accommodate a generation that is used to ordering in their experiences, whether they want to have it in their home or in their communities or amongst friends. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Ordering in there.
Good evening. It's an honor to be here and to be with such an illustrious panel and to, frankly, not be the historian. I want to just reflect on a little bit of history, if it's okay with my colleagues. There's an infamous essay that was written about our Jewish community called The Ever-Dying People. We have this obsession that whenever we are gathered thinking about the Jewish future, it's a dire moment. And we are filled with worry and anxiety about the future. And that's kind of our Jewish way with this question. I want to suggest something completely countercultural. I'm actually not worried about the American Jewish future. It's not that I'm asleep. It's not that I am unaware of the complexity of the world that we are finding ourselves in and trying to find our way through. But I would point out throughout Jewish history, we have been the most resilient, adaptive, imaginative people perhaps ever to walk this earth. To think of the year 70 and the second temple is destroyed, and there's not even the substance of Jewish life, but somehow with the intense commitment to doing holy work in the world, we reinvented Jewish life. I'd like to suggest that the Jewish future is not going to happen. I'm going to be audacious. It's our job to shape it. And we're going to shape it so it is a time of not just possibility and vitality, but I am certain it's not going to look like it looks today, or frankly, like it looked 30 years ago, 50 or 100 years ago. Next week, we're going to celebrate the 200th birthday of Isaac Mayer Wise, the founder of Reform Judaism. In 1873, he created something called the Union of American Hebrew Congregations. No reform in there. He was trying to create an American Judaism because he knew that this was a new moment in the life of our people. This was a new country with a new ethos. And he could not have imagined, I don't think my predecessors 50 years ago could have imagined that the largest movement in Jewish life in the year 2019 would be the Reform movement. Everyone had predicted that the Orthodox would gain ascendancy, but the truth is we're here, we're all adapting. And what I find most challenging is that for many of us in Jewish leadership, we endlessly worry why young people are not more like us. Why don't they join synagogues? Why don't they care? Why don't they give? Why don't they do the way we did, the way we cared? And what we know about Jewish history is we actually have to make a space for something new to be not just created, but shaped. And I think it's the job of those of us who care deeply about the Jewish present to make space for the younger leaders in our community, to not be wedded to the bureaucracy of Jewish life. I actually think what people are hungry for, and with our Facebook and our phones and all the things that we sometimes get distracted by, what I am confident is each of us is looking to live a life of purpose and depth and meaning. That we're hoping to shape the world as our tradition commands us to do, a world of wholeness, a world of compassion, a world of justice. And I think that the way we experience that may not have the same buildings. When I was ordained, you graduated from rabbinical school, you got a synagogue. It came with Jews, pews, books, staff, and a budget. And today, largely what we do is we go out and create. We create community. We create connection, whether it's on the college campus or in our communities. And I think the technology, by the way, is potentially powerful for us, but not as the thing itself. The thing itself, and I'm pretty confident that in 25 and 50 years, we're going to have a textual tradition that is going to anchor our lives with depth. It's going to challenge us with the biggest questions that face humankind. We're going to find ways to spiritually mark sacred moments. We're going to build community, and we're going to stand sometimes righteously and sometimes defiantly for a world that loses its way when it comes to morality and conscience. I don't know exactly what it's going to look like, but it's going to be less hierarchical. All the technology allows everyone, instead of asking their wonderful rabbis, and God bless that we have wonderful rabbis to ask questions, but half of us, if we have a question about medicine, we're going to go check WebMD. And if we have a question about Jewish life, we might just Google Rabbi Google and see what she says. We're going to see less of that hierarchy, but more empowerment, and we're going to see new forms and new expressions of what Jewish core commitments might look like. I think synagogues are the most resilient institution the Jewish people has ever created. But if people learn in one place, pray in another, act kindly towards one another in another institution, that will be the marrow of Jewish life. Bureaucracies, all the alphabet soup of Jewish life, that's not the ikar, that's not the essence. We could do with less of the scaffolding and more of the essence. And I'm hoping that the Jewish future that we're going to shape, which is going to be more diverse than any Jewish community that has ever lived, I hope it will be the most creative. It is certainly the most resourced community that has ever existed. We have enough resources to build the most elaborate, vibrant, inspiring Jewish community. What's it waiting for? All of us. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you all for those opening remarks. I have a lot I want to ask about those remarks, but I'm going to stick to our questions for now, and hopefully I can get some of those other ideas into the remarks as well, into the answers to the questions as well. All of you, I think, spoke really sort of big picture about the Jewish future. I'm wondering if maybe you could crystallize some of it around the first question. What keeps you optimistic about when you think about the future in Judaism in America? What? Not yet. We can put that back. I'll let you know when we need the slide. You can take the slide down, please. Thank you. All right. So what keeps you optimistic when you think about the future of Judaism in America? Maybe there's a story. Maybe there's a specific idea that you could help us see this optimism with.
I'm in a very privileged place. So when people speak to me, they say, "Oh, you study, you teach about Jewish community. Isn't it so depressing?" And I'm like, no. So my students, obviously, the ability to engage in the tough questions and just working, the ability to ask the tough questions about our community and what it should be and what we want it to be is a very hopeful place, even though the challenges are certainly there.
Are we going in order?
No, it can be whoever.
Well, can I just throw in, Yehuda Amichai, the great contemporary Israeli poet, said that we are niguei tikva. Niguei from nega, which is a plague, right, infected. Tikva, hope. And that optimism is, sometimes, that smiley face someone might put on a little, kind of face to just brighten the day. I think hope is a commandment. It's an obligation. And again, it doesn't mean to be naive, but I think when I see particularly young people, I'll give a story. So we know about the Parkland shooting. 2 days after the horrific slaughter in Parkland, the students from our two Reformed congregations got on a bus to go to Tallahassee. And they had learned at one of our seminars called Litaken about showing up in elected officials' offices. And they showed up. They were raw when they went. And they went into one particular elected official who started by saying, "Kids, I feel badly. But you know what you should do? You should go home, do your homework, take care of one another. Leave the government to us." Well, one particular young leader, 17-year-old Zoe Turner, said, "Excuse me." So my nifty leaders, put your hand up. Nifty leaders, you know that Zoe Turner is currently the nifty social action vice president. But she said on that day, she said, "Excuse me. We have a teaching in Judaism. It says, Lo alecha hamlacha ligmor. You are not obligated to finish the task, but you are not free to walk away. And we are not going to go home and leave it to you. We're going to hold you accountable because we just watched our friends slaughtered at school. And that's not a reflection of a government doing its job. So we're going to go back to Parkland, but we're going to keep watch on what you do and what everyone does in this legislature. And we're going to make the future better than we have found it. And thank you for your leadership. So people tell me, young people, they don't care, they don't know, they don't do. I said, that's not my experience. And I'm sure so you could keep us here all night telling story after story about the kind of leadership, the kind of commitment, the kind of Jewish informed, learned, inspired action that takes place. If you want to be inspired, you want to have optimism, we are niguei tikva, and we have good reason to be.
I think similarly. I mean, I, like Karla, get to work with students and be inspired by them every day and learn from them every day. I'm constantly optimistic because I get to see what they create. And here they are coming from their parents' homes. This is the first time that they get to make choices of what they're going to do in their lives, and they're choosing to do Jewish, and they're choosing to make it relevant to them, meaningful to their peers, and bring people out. I think what the concern that I have is the transition out of college life, and in particular out of college life and until sometimes I think that they're not taken seriously as full leaders in American Jewish community until they are in families and making choices of joining synagogues, or they are in leadership in financial positions to be considered leaders again in the Jewish community by joining boards. What I worry about for our students is I see when they're on campus that they can bring all of their interests and all of their identities into a Hillel space, and they can join this minyan, and they can be involved in this basketball group, and they can do social action here, and they don't feel like they have to just pick one. They can do all of these different things. And what we hear from our alums is that they struggle after because they feel like some of the organizations that are intended for them as young adults, first of all, they dumb it down to like the bar nights for them to be able to meet each other. Or they feel like in order to join a particular institution or organization, they have to align with every single part of that organization rather than have the diversity of what they can pick and choose from. So they're not picking, they're not choosing, they're not joining as members, they're not paying. And I really want to send them out into a Jewish world that is going to have a concierge service, just like our staff taking them out for coffee, or our engagement interns taking them out for coffee, asking them what they're interested in and plugging them into all these different things. I want there to be those concierge services in all of these major cities so that when they show up in New York, they're not lost by not knowing how to navigate, not knowing. I had a student who texted me after Pittsburgh, who was one of our leaders when she was on campus, would lead services on campus, graduated 3 years ago. She didn't have a synagogue to show up to right after Pittsburgh. And so I want to be able to send them off, to know that they're in good hands, to have somebody who lays out the diversity of what they can choose from, and that they don't have to narrowly pick and be put in the box again once they graduate.
This is really wonderful from all of them. I guess I would answer, with a typical Jewish saying, things could always be worse.
Yeah. Is that it?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Work on your Yiddish accent.
Besides for Deborah's comment, everybody else sort of focused on youth. I think let's go there. Just thinking about my own experience, I became a rabbi because of 3 crucial transformative extended moments in my youth. Right, Nifty, I found leadership, friendship, and real spiritual engagement there. Camp, I moved from a JCC camp as a youngster in North Georgia to Kutz Camp in New York. In both these settings, I deepened my Jewish knowledge and learned how to live in community. And at Hillel, at UC Santa Barbara, I became a Jewish resource for other students and began to develop spiritual leadership as well. And we've been talking about the way that we've been engaging youth, but it's also no secret that we struggle engaging kids today in ways that we didn't necessarily 20, 30, and more years ago. Okay. A while ago.
Yeah.
Could be worse.
Although I'll add that I just took 7 young leaders from Temple Beth Emeth to dinner before this event. They're here with us tonight, and and I was and although these are 7 young people who have shown leadership in very different ways in our synagogue, in BBYO, in other areas of Jewish life, I still worry about them as some of them are receiving college acceptance letters tonight, in fact. And I wonder, will they feel as connected as I did, even though they've been engaged deeply in the Jewish community? What will future Jewish leadership look like if we fail to engage young people at the same rate that maybe we used to? How must we change? What must we do differently? And are there innovations in particular that excite you and inspire you?
I like your concierge idea. That's really cool. I will add to that, when my oldest son came back from after college to New York, a couple of years down the road, he decided that he should create a book. I mean, it was one of these guidebooks. It was called Shalom New York. And he went around to all kinds of different Jewish organizations and synagogues, and he, to get the information to put together, depending on where you lived in New York, so you'd have this guidebook. And then, of course, he self-published it. It was a little expensive endeavor, and for a long time he had quite a few cartons of Shalom New York underneath his bed. But it's a great idea, and his was a self-generating answer to that, right? Because he'd been away at college and decided, okay, he was going to figure out New York, and that's how he did it. But he still uses Shalom New York as his email address.
I think what's interesting is that there are online platforms that'll do exactly that.
I'm sure there are.
In certain communities, you'll find an online platform where, especially if you're looking for high holiday services, it is wonderful to see how many high holiday services one could possibly attend in Chicago, and so intimidating because you don't know how to navigate it. So I think that it comes down to the personal relationship and connection, which is what concierge could offer. I think for me, I'm not worried. If there's a Josh Whinston among us, we're going to find him. I'm really not worried in the same way. I think for me, one of the most innovative pieces for us over the last couple of years is really how we've shifted our thinking from in Hillel to out of Hillel. And the most exciting time of the year for us is our Shabum, Shab-U-M, Shabbat across U-M. And it's one night a year, although you can have Shabbat in the home anytime, and it's supported anytime by our Hillel, but this is the time where we're really promoting it. And we close Hillel after services, and then we support Shabbat dinners across campus. And this past year, we had 87 Shabbat dinners, I think. Roughly, so tell me if I'm wrong. 87 Shabbat dinners and 1,600 students in one night, where we typically, in our building at that time, would have anywhere from 250 to 300 or so. So I'm not worried about, and I'm not worried about losing the ones that are going to come to Shabbat dinner all the time.
Sure.
You know, I'm really thinking about it as an arc of how we're helping them grow and what experiences they're having along their way. As freshmen, they need to have that comfort of coming to Shabbat. But by the time they're juniors and seniors and they're in their own homes, there's something so special about being pushed even to build the knowledge of how do I fit 12 people around this table for 4? Get their mother's kobo recipe, build the confidence of pulling off Shabbat dinner for their friends, or figuring out who they're going to dial that week, and knowing that falafel is just as meaningful around the Shabbat table as making their own meals. And there's something about building those memories also when they're on campus. So we see the lasting impact of that when they graduate from campus, and that's where I'm confident, because I know when they graduate from campus, there's one table as an organization that they can then go to, and we teach them about that so that they can keep that going. So I feel as if the more we think about how we can empower them to do Jewish and give them the tools to be able to do it and come together in community, the more we're going to see that they're both doing it for themselves and they're actually going to come to us.
And Tilly, has anybody ever funded research on students engaged in like that program?
No. If anybody would like to fund research
I mean,
of students engaged in that program,
but to really get the data, the hope is that students continue to do this.
One of the things that we actually have started to do over the last couple of years is for the students. I think we've done this for 4 or 5 years now, and the students know that this was something that they did on campus. We now send it out to our alumni to tell them the date that we're doing it, so that we encourage them to use that date as a way of finding community in their area, and whether it's through one table or just on their own, having Shabbat dinner on their own in their new community. And we, at Shaboom, we do these shabags. We send them out, a Go Blue challah cover and a block mem, Kiddush cup, and they feel a part of the things on campus even though they're away. And there was a student actually who just came back to visit. She must have graduated 6 years ago. She said it's the one time of year that she knows that she's going to see all of her, other than the weddings that they're all going to, that she's going to see all of her alumni friends and get together and be able to recreate that kind of experience.
Nice.
So can I just remind us, we're worrying about kids today. We should be thinking about creative ways to engage. But I'll just remember when I was young, I went to something called Hebrew school. Mm-hmm. Did anybody else go to this thing called Hebrew school?
Yep.
Did anybody have a just transformationally inspired time at Hebrew school?
Yes, I did.
So look,
Which is why I'm an
why you're
academic.
doing what you're doing. But I remember telling my father that Hebrew school was so boring, it was painful, it was all those things. My dad said yes, and it was for me, and it will be for your children as well. And I thought, that's a terrible answer. So what I actually would like to say is I think we have more ways to more deeply experience and engage, not just young people, because we've been obsessed with pediatric Judaism. The idea, frankly, we have a wonderful congregation that decided they had a decision to close their religious school. Not because they had too few students. They had over 150. But they closed the religious school and said, instead, we have 5 retreats that every family will go on together. And so there's no Tuesday, Thursday, no Monday, Wednesday, no Sunday morning, no faking like you're sick on Sunday morning, you can't go. And what they have found, again, this is a disruptive way to think about, first of all, 5 immersive experiences together. may in fact have more long-term impact in terms of creating a sense of Jewish attachment, a sense of experiencing the thing that you might have been talking about on Tuesday. But I wanted to follow that with, we're in a first-rate, world-class university at the moment. We've got phenomenal professionals who work. One of the things that's completely unique about this moment, we have more Jewish studies in our North American universities, because we are actually American and Canadian, just throwing that in there just so you know. We take the Canadians very seriously. And what we found out in the Jewish population surveys of the early 90s is if a student takes one college-level Jewish studies course, just that one course has a dramatic impact on how they conceive of Judaism and the Jewish community. Because for the first time they see, even if they went for 5 retreats at that wonderful congregation that's experimenting, they see that Judaism is this rich civilization. It has a history, an intellectual, a moral, philosophical depth. And all of a sudden, the stock comes up, and maybe the time when they cut out things and decorated the sukkah, which is wonderful, but to never have experienced something that is so profoundly at the heart of what really life could be. If we had every one of our young people taking one of those classes, just imagine the collective impact. But I do think that we're thinking differently about informal education, camp and formal learning. And we do lots of those things that create the spark. We need to actually figure out how to make this spark a flame. It's great to go 10 days on a free trip to Israel. Kol hakavod, that's wonderful. But you come back, and sometimes you come back to a college campus, sometimes you come back, you're already working. How do we find the ways to take a ladder of engagement so that if you get an experience that's powerful, that we can continuously show people how to go deeper, and that we don't stop in terms of the shallow end of the pool. It should be warm, it should be large. There's got to be deeper water, because that's actually what nourishes us. But if we only have deep water, I'm afraid we're not going to see enough people in the pool. But I think we're doing, in some ways, better with education and engagement today than we did certainly when I was young. And I think we could do better for the next generation as well.
Okay, can I respond a little, just to your metaphor about the pool? Which is, it's a nice metaphor, but what I was trying to do was to disrupt that notion, which you were doing a bit also when you said beyond the bima and beyond, and to sort of get us to look around at what it is actually that Jews do, and I'll tell you one of the things that Jewish families do these days, which completely mystifies me, except that I have a colleague who helps me to understand it, is they spend an awful lot of time on sports, right? I mean, sports is, when I said America influences American Jews, that has just swept over American Jews, and whether it's soccer for girls or basketball or whatever it is, group sports, and sports is a really big thing, and they don't have problems feigning sickness and stuff, so because they want to go to sports. So what I would say is that we need to look around at what it is that American Jews are doing, and sort of think about that as this constitutes Jewish practice. That means we have to change how we think about what constitutes Jewish practice. I mean, personally, I'm not interested in sports, and my son tells me, this was a lacuna in his education, that I didn't, so he's doing it whole hog for his kids. I think that trying to figure out by looking at what Jews actually do, we'll have real clues. So we're not about enticing them into the water, which is ours, but we're actually going to learn from them. So in America now, being Jewish means, playing basketball and soccer and that kind of stuff. And we need to interpret it. If you were going to go back to the ancient Greeks, you'd say, okay, physical culture and all that. But, okay, so now Judaism has physical culture as part of it.
But I think it's more because, honestly, we actually now have 2 summer camps that are sports camps.
See?
Why?
Yeah.
Because we imbue the sports with Jewish values, content around it.
Yep.
So it's not actually about the sports, it's about everything that goes around it. And it's starting where their interests are, whether
That's
it's science
correct.
and technology, if it's arts,
But-
whatever it might be, and beginning, as you said, where they are, what interests them, but not to be, I mean, there's, I think, something tonight having to do with sports. I'm not-
So I'll just say,
We'll get
I'll
out of
just
here
say
to the basketball game, don't
one
worry.
Totally
quick-
sure
one
about
quick
that.
one quick anecdote, not
Sure.
only tonight,
Yeah.
but last year, some people in the audience may remember that the second night Seder fell on a particularly important date in basketball history for this university. And the best thing that I saw, was one of our students putting together a Final Four Haggadah. So that the students could have their Seder in the home and watch the game at the same time. Integration, absolutely.
I just wanted to add one thing to this. Josh, you offered sort of a conventional narrative of Jewish engagement.
Sure.
And for many decades, there's been sort of conventional wisdom offered to us about camp and Israel and what's the third thing?
Day
Youth
school.
groups,
Day
days-
school.
youth groups,
And so going back to my wildly unrepresentative focus group through which I see everything these days, we talk about why people are in the room and why they're there. And what we found is really very interesting that it doesn't match up with that at all, right? And the stories are different, but there are clusters of them. And it may be about being in a rich community where your parents are really engaged with it. It may be being in a rich community and having to go somewhere where you're the only Jew to suddenly realize that it's important to you. It may be hitting a youth group or a Hillel that sort of suddenly made a difference. I mean, those are our stories. And that I think that we have to avoid, and I don't hear it here, but there's a tendency to say, maybe I'm going to go to this panel on the future of American Jewry and they'll tell me the formula.
Yeah.
Right? And I think
Sure.
the point is there is no formula, and that each of us has to find our own. And I actually learned something from you, Josh, on Rosh Hashanah from a sermon that you gave. You were talking about the beauty of study and sort of equating it with heaven. And that's what the rabbi said. That was what they thought of as heaven. And I realized that what I was offering my children was some version of what my father and mother offered me because that had worked for me. And then I was like, but I actually know different things than my parents knew. And what can I do in my space? So one thing we've started doing on Friday night is not making them read prayers, which they didn't like very much, which is what my father did, right? But that we study text, we study the portion. And we look both at the Hebrew and the English and try and sort of accrue some knowledge that we can carry from week to week. And that's what I can do. But I think the thing is, part of this is that we shouldn't only look to other institutions or our institutions, right? Like, what are we doing? Like, the stories of what people do in their families, which we don't talk, the synagogue is doing that for the families, creating those things. But what we do in our families is the most important thing. And because that's not an institutional thing, I guess we talk about family education, but that's the charge. How are each of us thinking, if we care about this, how are we making that difference? And you might not get what you want. It might be then, your kid will go out to Utah and suddenly care about this, right? But you at least create some kind of frame that's going to make it, they can go back to and say, I know that was important. And I still feel some of that. I know that's important to me. I'm not sure why. It's up to me with my concierge or someone else, to really find out what that is for me.
So I appreciate this as somebody on the pulpit in terms of pushing me to think about boundaries that maybe I've set up for myself and how I think about what people do and what is Jewish that they do. And just to contextualize, I think the conversation, even soccer, right? Let's say, for the ancient sages, I don't know if they would have thought of soccer as minhag. But minhag had the ability of taking on the weight of halakha, right? The weight of Jewish law. Not always, not in every circumstance, but our tradition has understood that from really the very beginning of rabbinic Judaism, that what the people are doing is what the people are doing, and you better be wise to that. And I thank you for lifting that up for us, all of you. The note cards are going to come around in a moment. I'm going to ask another question, and this I'm not going to get through all of the questions that I wanted to get through, which is fine. But I'm asking this question because when I sat with our teens, and asked them what should I ask this panel, and one of them suggested a question about anti-Semitism, and so it's a question about anti-Semitism, and I'll get there. You'll hear how I'm going to get there, I hope. One of the hardest things for Jews to accept and discuss is our power. Jewish power is real today in ways it wasn't just a generation or two ago. And by that I mean our acceptance in national leadership, our ability to influence national and international conversations, leadership in corporate America, in universities, and yes, even a nation state. These are just some of the ways that we've moved out of the shtetl. Given our history, it is difficult for 20th century Jews to discuss this openly. However, if we're going to take a real look in the mirror, we must come to understand ourselves as powerful, not just victims. In recent months and even weeks, our community has felt under attack, both physically and rhetorically. What does anti-Semitism mean in the 21st century? Does our relative power to ages past necessarily change our response to threats? How could we be using the power that we have more effectively in combating 21st century anti-Semitism?
I was so grateful that you really pushed with this question, because the language of Jewish power makes me feel very uncomfortable, because I see it used in particular on university campuses from both the right and the left as real anti-Semitism. And it makes me very uncomfortable, and yet it's something that we need to push ourselves to be talking about, because it's also a reality, and we need to figure out ways to be able to talk about it that don't sound so anti-Semitic.
Yeah.
I think that we are already using our power in very powerful ways to combat 21st century anti-Semitism. I just think that people right now, in particular after Pittsburgh, are in a deep state of fear, that they're not willing to see it or hear it or believe it, that we actually do have power. The front page of the Pittsburgh Gazette after the Tree of Life attack was the first line of the Kaddish. And I'm in direct conversation, anything anti-Semitic that happens on campus, I have the privilege and the power to be in direct communication with administration and leadership of this university when it happens. So I'm just not sure if any amount of power that we have can prevent anti-Semitism from happening, and that's really what people want.
Sure.
They want to prevent it from happening. We can only influence the response, which is exactly what we are doing in very powerful ways.
Yeah.
But I want to go push a little bit further on the anti-Semitism piece.
Please.
Because I think that there is real deep division in our community right now, in particular around when does anti-Israel become anti-Semitism. And I know that the criticism that I experience as a leader is almost always around when somebody feels as if I am overreacting or underreacting to what they see as anti-Semitism or not anti-Semitism, and it's usually the same incidents. And I also think that we are using the label of anti-Semitism too widely, and we are lumping anti-Semitic incidents together that, in my experience and opinion, do not belong together, and they do not hold equal weight. So, for example, after Pittsburgh, when people talked, I'm thinking in particular about fall at University of Michigan, and hearing people talk in the same breath about the tragic shooting in the Tree of Life synagogue, and also a professor rescinding a letter of reference for students studying at Tel Aviv University, and using the same language and speaking about them at the same time, it makes me feel as if we need to be very careful about the words that we choose and the power of those words. Because, and I don't want to minimize that letter. It was significant, and it was severe, and it was dealt with severely, but that student is studying at Tel Aviv University right now.
Yeah.
And so I think what we need to remember is that these two were not equivalent. and that the language, when we use that kind of language to talk in particular about campus, we are reinforcing a language that makes people feel unsafe on university campuses, or think that University of Michigan is not a safe place to send Jewish students today. And I strongly disagree with that.
Yeah.
I also think Tree of Life in Pittsburgh is not an unsafe place to send for people to pray today. But I think that the way in which we're using this language together is very dangerous.
Yeah, thank you.
So I think we got to use our power, not just for our own safety, which we need to. I was stunned the day of the Pittsburgh shooting. I was in Israel, and I spent Shabbat with our high school students who were there living for the semester and studying. And at Shabbat lunch, one of the students asked me, Rabbi Jacobs, have you ever experienced personally anti-Semitism? Not knowing what was going to happen, of course, because obviously people were still sleeping in Pittsburgh. And I said, not really in a significant way. I said, how about all of you? May I see the hands of those of you, 16 and 17 years old, who have personally experienced anti-Semitism? Not that you read about something, not that you heard it from your Bubi or your Zaidi, and 2/3 of the hands went up. Wow. And I think that was unimaginable 50 years ago. And I do think, anti-Semitism is real. By the way, it's real. I just came back from the APAC conference, as did Tilly and a whole group of wonderful students and activists from all over. And anti-Semitism was wielded like a club in political speeches over and over again. And it becomes, frankly, objectionable when we're not discerning and clear. And when we think there's one segment in America that is, guilty of the anti-Semitism, it's across the spectrum. And I just remember intensely after the shooting in Pittsburgh, which of course followed the, think of the shooting at the Mother Emanuel Church in AME Church in Charleston, and follow the Sikh temple and on in our house of worship. But when I heard people say it's like the 1930s again, here is, to me, the most profound difference. And here's where we've used our power in a really constructive way. And that is when, Kristallnacht happened and synagogues were burned and Jewish businesses were overrun. The interfaith community didn't rise up and stand with us and say, next week when you go to synagogue, it's going to be dangerous, so we're going to come with you. We're going to be protective. We have built through deep relationship and showing up for others. We've used our power to call out racism and bigotry, which I believe doesn't automatically mean that everyone will be paying attention to our anti-Semitic experiences that still continue. But we have built the infrastructure for a much more interconnected world. I was asked to testify at the Knesset Committee on Aliyah recently, and a number of the members of Knesset said, isn't it time for American Jews to get the message? It's time for all of you to come home to Israel. And I said, first of all, I am deeply in favor of Aliyah. I think it's a profound expression of Jewish peoplehood and connection. But if you think that living a life of safety and of Jewish authenticity in the United States of America is not possible, then the entire project of modernity has gone not just a little bit wrong, it has gone to a place of disaster. So, I think what's more important for the Knesset members, and I said, is to don't tell us what our experience is, but to listen how we are not just responding, but building a more, I would say, interconnected religious community, and that we're not going to be naive about the reality of anti-Semitism, but we're not going to think that all is lost. The last thing is the graph for anti-Semitism, racism, Islamophobia, and anti-immigrant. Just amazingly, it's a graph that goes pretty much in exactly the same angle. We are living at a moment where the proliferation of hate and violence towards others is really quite stunning. We need to call out uniqueness of anti-Semitism, but if we use our power to only call out the uniqueness of anti-Semitism and don't show up and don't speak out and don't raise our voices for those who are actually dying in much greater numbers than our people, then we will have used our power for naught. Thank you.
Yes.
I just want to call attention to there's a heightened, awareness and sensitivity to anti-Semitism, but also to the places where there's sort of ambivalence about it. And there are sectors in Jewish community where others might think anti-Semitism is not taken seriously. There was we're all aware of recent controversy about the Women's March. In the sense that there was anti-Semitism resident there. And, it was a very painful conversation, right? Because the conversation was, if you're asking me to look aside from that, you're asking me to look away from the vulnerability of my people, the suffering of my people, the deaths of my family in the past or in October. And how can you ask me to do that? It's a really tough thing to say. Continue to work together with groups that are theoretically sharing the graph and sharing the concerns. And this is a really tough place. And where you ask, okay, you're asking me to look aside, what hubris that is to say, this time I'm not going to really look at anti-Semitism, I'm going to value other things. Because who are we to feel so safe in a history that shows that it might be a mistake to feel safe. So that's where, sort of thinking about where we do stand in this society and what anti-Semitism means is something that challenges us. And if we realize that, as you're saying, anti-Semitism is everywhere, why are we expecting the people that we want to work with to understand it the extent that we do, right? Like, what's the work? What are we called on to do? If you believe that this is an alliance that's important, to sort of judge people. This is this thing that we do, that we shouldn't do, which was we flatten each other, right? And you say one thing and you're dead to me. But we know that a lot of people, and some people who have visited campus recently, have been part of that trying to educate or to reach out and create the relationships in which the conversations can take place. We can get more to a shared understanding. So, that's an important part also, and it also comes up in sort of opinions on Israel. Right? That those who are critical of Israel, who are you in the history of the Jewish people not to suddenly not care about this and the safety of our people? But there's more of a conversation to be had.
So I think everybody said really great things about power and anti-Semitism. And I guess as a historian, I would just look back a bit and think about the post-World War II years, which really shaped many of the institutions and the attitudes towards combating anti-Semitism. And one of the things that occurred in those years was a recognition of a kind of a continuum that existed among anti-Semitic acts and language, and that could lead to ever worsening expressions of it. And at the same time, there was also a conclusion that was drawn that the best ways to fight anti-Semitism was to do exactly what you said, which is to say, to try to mobilize Jewish power in alliance with other groups, because anti-Semitism flourishes when other groups are also under attack. There used to be popular quoting of a Protestant minister in Germany that said, when they came for the Jews, I didn't pay any attention. When they came for the socialists, I didn't pay any attention, etc. And then finally, they came for me. As a means of suggesting the importance of alliances, and that you can't only focus on anti-Semitism, because anti-Semitism is rooted in institutions in the society, and you have to work broadly for a more just society and against hate as it comes into its expressions. So that's part of one of the opportunities and challenges, real challenges, of having a certain measure of power that it is conditioned by a knowledge at the same time that Jews are vulnerable. And it's an unusual mix to have both power and vulnerability together, and how to manage it.
I'm going to move us along because I want to get to at least I want to do two more questions, one mine and one from the audience here. So if we could go to the second slide, please, that was provided. On January 4th of this year, Jonathan Weissman wrote an opinion piece in the New York Times entitled, "American Jews and Israeli Jews are headed for a messy breakup. Is the world ready for another great schism?" In that article, Weissman wrote, "Israeli politicians and citizens are increasingly dismissive of the views of American Jews anyway. Evangelical Christians, ardently pro-Israel, give Jerusalem a power base in Washington that is larger and stronger than the American Jewish population. The divide between American Jews and Israeli Jews goes beyond politics. Israel's chief Ashkenazi rabbi, after the slaughter in Pittsburgh, refused to refer to the conservative Tree of Life as a synagogue at all, calling it a place with a profound Jewish flavor." Weissman continues, American Jewry has been going its own way for 150 years, as Deborah mentioned earlier. A drift that has created something of a new religion, or at least a new branch of one of the world's most ancient faiths. Without debating the particular points Weissman makes, is he on to something here? Is there more than a gap between American Jews and Israeli Jews? And if there is a schism, is it one that we care about fixing? Do we think Israel cares to work on improving the relationship?
Do you have any hard questions?
All right, I would say this. So every time something happens in Israel where I'm sort of appalled and disgusted by what the Israeli government is doing, I think about Tilly. I'm like, why did they just make Tilly's job that much harder? It's impossible, right? I mean, it's a real challenge, so I'll let you take it.
So I'll let you answer this question. No, I think what's fascinating is I've been here this is my 11th year now. I have not seen interest in birthright decline. I have not seen a shift in the number of Jewish students who want to be engaged. I mean, it's in Israel, I see more students who want to, Jewish students who want to take on internships through onward programs. I mean, the engagement is still there. I also see a tremendous criticism in our Jewish community, and I see that rising as well. But I think what's interesting is that I don't see those who are protesting birthright on the diag, those who are, really not just critical of Israel, but really protesting Israel and finding Jewish community in their protests against Israel's actions. They're doing it from a deeply Jewish place as well.
Yeah.
And so they just have a particular expectation of what is a Jewish and democratic state.
I think that goes to Weissman's point, though.
Right, yeah. Right. So I don't see them, I'm sometimes on the receiving end of that protest, but I don't see them as self-hating Jews or any lesser of Jews. I see them as really very passionately connected to Israel. They just want Israel to be something different. Yeah. The ones that I worry about are the ones that say, I just don't know enough. I just don't know enough. I'm not going to get involved. This isn't. And I always, when I hear I don't know enough, I always think that it's actually them saying, this isn't important enough for me to risk my relationship with you in this moment. When I hear someone in social justice communities or taking liberal arts or in women's studies or whatever it may be, and they don't feel like they know enough or really want to be the defender of Israel in that moment, there's something about them saying, this is not what I'm going to risk my relationship or risk my career or risk my whatever it may be over. But it's mostly, I actually think on college campuses, it's mostly about the social interaction. And they don't want it to be a barrier. And I actually think that it's a shame because I think that there's an opening up of being able to talk. I mean, the Women's March was a great example of how flattened Jews were by the left and the right, by people saying to them, don't march unless you're good with anti-Semitism from our own Jewish community. I mean, that just flattens anyone who is struggling with this and who wants to march, or the criticism from other places. And so I think if we can really help our students find the sense of why they feel the struggle around Israel and root that in their Jewish identity, then I think that they are going to be able to really bring that forward and engage more.
I mean, I think it's just obvious that we have an illiberal Israeli government at the moment.
Yes.
And we have a very liberal North American Jewish community. Those are simply facts. There may be judgments that come along with that. We are not on the same trajectory. And I remember vividly when Prime Minister Netanyahu once said to me, he said, American Jews, particularly the young ones, don't know and don't care about Israel. I said, I think you're wrong. I think they know, but they care differently than you do. And I would say that I love when young people bring their whole toolbox of Jewish values to everything they do, whether that is facing criminal justice reform here in the United States, or frankly, the amazing and dramatic and horrific uptick of anti-Semitism in France, or addressing things like a racist party in Israel. They are bringing their Jewish values, and that is a good thing. And by the way, what we're working very hard is to connect young people and all of us, not to any one political party here or there, or any one political candidate, but to the values upon which Jewish life is built, the values upon which the state of Israel are built, and let's connect to something that actually is not as ephemeral as the headlines from yesterday or tomorrow, which are not things that you could organize your deepest beliefs and commitments. And I think we are, there have been dramatic things that have been done to push the diaspora away from the state of Israel and from the people there. But survey after survey of Jewish Israelis say they feel it's important to be part of something larger, a sense of peoplehood. And I think it's hard for us, and that was one of the questions we're not going to get to, but I think for many of our young people, they have a sense that Judaism is a core set of ethical commitments, ritual practices, some key nodal moments in the life cycle, but the sense of peoplehood, the sense that I'm connected to those people who are from very different ethnicities than I am. They have very different language even, and food, and maybe even cultural norms, but I'm part of the same extended family. I think we're not doing a very good job, and frankly, that is one of the underpinnings.
You would disagree then with Weissman's proposition here?
Listen, I think some of what he says is simply factually true, and I think that for us who worry about Jewish life and are responsible for creating Jewish community, to create the sense that I could be connected to. I'll give you an example. I was at Shimon Peres's funeral a couple years ago. Naftali Bennett, who leads the settler party in Israel, I saw him across the expanse on Mount Herzl, and I went over to him and I gave him a very long, warm embrace. Somebody from the Reform movement in Israel came up to me after and said, "What were you doing? Do you know who that is?" I said, "Of course I know who that is. When my father died 2.5 years ago, Naftali Bennett reached out to express his condolences to me. 3 weeks later, his father died, and I reached out to express my condolences to him. I had just finished my first year of mourning for my father, and he was about to finish his first year of mourning. I simply embraced another member of the Jewish people with whom I disagree on simply everything. But we are somehow bound together in the commonality of fate. And I don't know how we are successfully implanting that sense of mutual responsibility, that I can disagree loudly, but at the end of the day, there's something that connects us. I think that's what happens on a birthright trip. There's something inside that starts to get activated, but I am concerned about how we can strike that and not lose our moral clarity at the same time.
So I began my talk with David Vital's statement from 1990 and the growing gap. I think in some ways it's a bit like the ever-dying people, that there's always this growing gap. At least it's been true for 30, if not more than like 40 or 50 years. I do think one point that he made, I know you said we're not supposed to respond to the specifics, but there's one point that Weissman makes that's really accurate, and it has to do with the supremacy of the Orthodox rabbinate in Israel. I mean, when I see the kinds of statements and the demands that they make, as a historian, it only makes me realize even more why all those Eastern European Jews were not interested in having rabbis. They had had enough of rabbinic authority in Eastern Europe, and they came to America, and you know, the streets of New York and Chicago and Philadelphia, and it was just fine. Yeah.
What she said.
Sorry.
Yes. So I want to. We're over time already, but I want to ask one more question from everybody gathered here, and I'm sorry I couldn't get to all of them. What good models have you seen for confronting and ending racism and Ashkenormativity in our increasingly diverse American Jewish community? What more can we do to fight racial oppression within our community?
Well, let's tell the
Some
truth
stories.
about what the experience is. I mean, we have remarkable leaders of color within our community, within our movement. And one tells a story that when he was 13, he was going to all his friends, bar bat mitzvahs, that's what you do. And it happened more than once that he would be at the party afterwards, and a caterer would hand him a tray of food to serve. Now, you could say it could happen anywhere to anyone. I walk into a synagogue with a member of our senior leadership who's African American and Native American and Jewish, and I get handed a prayer book, and she's handed a brochure for visitors to the synagogue. Mm-hmm. Now, there was, honestly, you could just say those are just mistakes that people can make. But everyone was making an assumption about me and an assumption about her and an assumption about the 13-year-old. We actually have within our Jewish community this, not only that Ashkenazim are normative, but that white is normative. Jews of color are between 10 and 20% of our Jewish community, but we don't see 10 and 20. So we've got to face, before we can straighten it out everywhere in the world, and we need to, it's right here in our family. I think first thing is just holding the mirror up, telling the truth, and then to get busy how it is that we, kind of educate and expose to the fullness of who we are when we're really honest. Yeah.
So my mother, who's getting on in years, is a member of a congregation that's led by a African-American convert, Rabbi, who's a lesbian, with a non-Jewish partner. So I think she sort of embodies all the things you're not supposed to be, right? She's fantastic. And one of the things that's happened as the result of her leadership is that more and more people of color have started to join the congregation because it's just sort of normalized it. There used to be one or two there, but now it's not 10%, but it's growing. And so I think that's a potential kind of model. What we can do is to recognize leaders and give them an opportunity to show us a new way of doing things Jewish.
So you're referring to Rabbi Georgette Kennebrae,
That's right.
who was here a few weeks ago
She's
for
great.
our conference on American feminisms. And she and others who are part of the conference and also in other spaces made a point that's really painful, which is, and I've heard many more than Georgette say this, that they go through this racist society and that the most racism that they've felt has been in the Jewish community. Mm-hmm. And these are people who have stuck with it and have chosen to be leaders.
She wears a kippah, right? She said in that thing. And
Yes.
when she walks the streets of New York, the most comments she gets are anti-Jewish comments, in relation to the kippah. Yeah.
And so just in terms of that holding up a mirror, it's right, not just only our expectations, but to what does that mean? What does that experience mean? How do we take that seriously. I think that we can re-see. I think that, there was very little familiarity with, so seeing somebody of color in a Jewish congregation there, I think there was this immediate assumption among the members of those congregations who were white, there's something out of place here. But I think that can change. I mean, I think you can, when you stop looking at it in that way, or when there are enough people around to make the congregation look different, you stop seeing that difference and you begin to see Jews. So, I mean, it's a challenge. How do we move more towards that? And one of the things, which is very challenging, is we can't just rely on those leaders to carry that burden, but to sort of figure out what that means for the rest of us.
But I think that there's the centering that you talked about earlier. And I felt that in terms of the Women's March, when Yavila McCoy and others really put a call out to white Jewish community saying, we are centering Jewish women of color who do not have the luxury of stepping out of the Women's March in the way that others do. And we are calling in our white Jewish partners and allies to support us. And that was very powerful for me, very powerful for others. I feel like for me, I do a lot of work around safety, respect, equity, and we think a lot about men as allies. And I feel as if I'm learning a lot about men as allies by thinking about what does it mean to be a white Jewish ally to, in particular, Jewish women of color, and how to center them in many ways and hold myself back in particular spaces in order for them to be elevated. And I'll say on that panel, I noted that it was the first time that I was ever on a panel where there were 3 Jewish women of color and 2 white Jewish women, that we were outnumbered. And it was not a panel about color or race.
Right.
And that's what was so wonderful about it. And that it's not lost on me, that was the contemporary panel. And I think that everybody saw that is where we are today as a Jewish community. And so my hope is in the future that we will see this is normative.
Amen.
I want to add one more thing about both Yavila McCoy, who spoke at Hillel, and April Baskin, who was here for that conference, and for the Students' Conference on the Jewish Future as Feminists. Because both of them, so one of the responses to the Women's March, and both April and Yavila were 2 of the 3 Jewish women who were added to the Women's March board in Washington. The third is a transgender woman. And some of the response in the Jewish community to that is like, oh, that doesn't count. What do
That doesn't represent
there was
me.
Right, there was all this concern about Jewish representation and recognizing Jews, and they added 2 women of color and a transgender woman, so that doesn't represent me. And both April and Yavila, while they were here at Michigan, made the point, oh, and so every time I've seen Jews represented by white men, white women, that's supposed to represent me, and suddenly now, when people look a bit different, that no longer represents us. So that sort of raises that question: is who are the we? And we have to change it. We.
And just throwing we have a new podcast that April Baskin began called Holy Jewish. These are people who've been in our Juvenation Fellowship. These are Jews of color who are taking on new leadership roles. And April interviews one after another, and they are painful, but they are, at the end of the day, they are that collective mirror that we need to hold up. So if you're a person who listens to podcasts, Holy Jewish, as in WHOLLY, and the quest to be feeling that wholeness within and from around. But these are wonderful teachers that can help all of us get closer to the world that we need.
All of you, to a certain extent, in one way or the other, as you began your comments, addressed one particular issue of sort of, Tilly, I think you said it the most concisely, not that students don't want separate identities, but that I think in some way, so all 4 of you addressed that issue of showing up as your whole self, as a Jew, as an American, as all of the diversity that exists within each person. And I think that in some ways the responses to the questions have also gone there, including the response to this most recent question. I think I remember going to in I think it was my second year of rabbinical school and reading about and learning about the emancipation of Jewish communities in Europe, and this notion of being, a Frenchman on the street and a Jew in the synagogue. And I think while that sort of sense of identity has been changing for a long time, hopefully, we're moving into an era where we can be more fully our whole selves wherever we are, in whatever situation we are. And I think that would probably be good for everybody. Thank you so much for being here with us, for your thoughts. Thank you as well for your leadership in the Jewish community, and we are lucky to have, especially the three of you, Karla and Deborah and Tilly and Arbor, immensely lucky.
And Josh.
And to Rick, your leadership of the Reform movement of my movement. Thank you for your continued leadership and representation. Thank you all.